Pericle is an app-driven RPG that I can only describe as an RPG mixed with a choose-your-own-adventure mixed with a board game. Describing it as D&D having a demon baby with Gloomhaven actually doesn't quite do it justice because it's a bit more than that and it's a bit less in some ways. The first adventure module for Pericle, called Gathering Darkness, along with the underlying software, was successfully funded on Kickstarter, and the developers reached out to me about doing a rundown of their game. As always, I'll give my dead honest opinion throughout the video and summary of my thoughts at the end. The physical aspect of the game exists as a series of hex maps, heavy acrylic standees, rules booklets, character sheets, handouts, and specialty dice. I was sent a prototype of this game that included maps that were printed on thick photo paper, but the final product will have maps on board game style chipboard, which is much thicker and sturdier. The dice are pretty nice. I'll go over what all the symbols mean later in the video. The most remarkable components are the thick acrylic standees, which have hexagonal bases because combat is hex-based in this game, and it's important to know where the characters are facing. I was not able to sample Pericle's actual product box, which I assume is a nice sturdy game box with cool artwork. At the time of this recording, the game is in distribution phase to Kickstarter backers. The second major component of this game is the software-driven story and combat strategy app. This browser-based program is called Loremaster, and you can run it on a computer or tablet, but not on mobile phones just yet. It acts as the game master in this game, guiding you through a story that has been pre-written and illustrated with light animations.
The temple fires blaze day and night. The forum is situated at the intersection of the Merchant Palace.
The first of these stories, called Gathering Darkness, is one of several that creators intend to tell and have you experience with the Pericle rule system. The other chief role of Loremaster is to help in running combat encounters. It will roll initiative for you and keep track of enemy abilities, hit points, and statuses, as well as whose turn and what phase of combat it currently is. You still have to tell Loremaster where everyone is on the physical map, and you have to keep track of your PC's hit points and XP on a physical character sheet. And although the program tells you what a monster or enemy does at any given turn, it is only slightly context dependent. In other words, it's not doing a whole lot of thinking. You're not being pitted against a strategically minded AI or anything. Enemy actions are triggered by a little bit of context, like how close you are to them, but nothing deep. In fact, the rulebook suggests that after a little while playing this game, you might end up ignoring Rulemaster's enemy action suggestions altogether in favor of your own more dynamic and strategic actions. The whole idea here is to be able to play out a tabletop RPG story with strategic combat, but without having to line up a game master. As we all know, there are just more players out there than there are GMs for any given game, so if you can sidestep the GM requirement, there's a higher chance of getting a game to your table. That being said, at a table where people are playing Pericle, at least one person kind of needs to know how everything works, which is to say, at least one person sort of needs to be a quasi-game master in terms of rules knowledge. So here's how the game actually works. A lot of this game hinges on a D10, which they call the action die. Anytime you are making a check of any sort, you are rolling this D10. 4 sides have this bullseye symbol that means you are successful. The explosion symbol means you scored a critical success, which only applies to combat. The numbers 1 through 4 mean that you may or may not be successful depending on the target number. If a task has a target number of 2, for example, then you need to either roll one of those success symbols or a 2 or a 1 to succeed. So in that sense, it's a roll under system. And finally, there is the strike through bullseye, which indicates a critical failure. Anytime you roll a critical success, you then roll a special D6 crit die, which will either give you a crit effect that depends on which weapon you used, double damage, both the effect and double damage, or a choice between the crit effect and double damage. Sometimes the circumstances will make a test particularly difficult, in which case the D6 defense die has to be rolled alongside the action die. This die has a shield on 4 sides, which indicate that whatever you are trying to do automatically fails, even if it was a crit success. A full torch symbol gives the defender +1 point of armor against any incoming damage. An empty torch symbol reduces the target number by 1, and a blank face means that there's no modification to the action die roll. I think the most important rules concept in the game revolves around the embattled condition. Things like movement rate, lines of sight, and cover are fairly intuitive, but what you really need to pay attention to when reading through the rules is when a character is embattled or not. Embattled basically means that they are engaged in combat and thus limited in movement. If you're trying to move along the map but end up in a space where an enemy can strike you with a melee attack, you have to stop because you have been embattled. This is pretty much any time you're standing in an enemy's front 3 hexes. Long story short, this sort of sticky behavior creates an environment where you have to be strategic about where you're moving in relation to enemies. There's a fairly strong expectation that you will grapple with enemies as well, so the grapple rules are extensive enough that your character actually has a grapple rating. There are also all the movement rules you would expect from a grid or hex-based combat game. As far as creating your character, you first determine your 3 core attributes, might, dexterity, and knowledge. These are rated from 0 to 4, and again, when rolling the D10 action die, you want to get either the success bullseye or at or below your target number, which starts with the stat in the case of attribute tests, but can be modified up or down depending on gear, abilities, and circumstances. There are 5 ancestries that each confer special abilities. Everkin are basically halflings. Forest elves are your standard sort of fantasy elf. Humans are also described in terms that I would say are pretty standard in the fantasy context. Odrim are a sort of dusky, brainy, magical elf type, and stone dwarves are mountainy dwarves. I think the most interesting thing about XP in this game is how, as you pick up 1 or 2 XP per fight, you can steadily increase skills that don't get higher in price as you level them up. They always cost 2 XP per rank, all the way up to level 5. But you can also use XP to pick up spells, which each have different costs. Selecting your weapon is quite simplified. You're really just deciding on the weapon type or class, of which there are about 6. Then you choose armor, which, as you would expect, will force you to trade protection for freedom of movement. Things get interesting mechanically when you choose your so-called disciplines as well as spells. You need to have the knowledge score prerequisite for any of these that you choose, but once you get a couple on board, you begin to see some fun play options. Each character has a base action die score, and that's used for most actions that you take in combat, including attacking and spells. Your base AD is equal to your dexterity, adjusted by armor and modifiers from disciplines. Once you have your base AD, you can derive the AD for each of your weapons. The first Pericle story in the series, Gathering Darkness, starts you off in chains on a ship and quickly dumps you into an arena as a pit fighter. The story uses the arena fights to throw some tutorials at you, but again, the Loremaster app doesn't do most of the number crunching, you do. So you really need to learn the rules at some point. In that sense, Pericle is really more of a tabletop RPG or board game than a video game. As you progress through the story, you're given dialogue choices that can unpack a lot of exposition or skipped over, and it's at this point that I sat back and enjoyed the story as a solo player, but I'm not sure how it would work in a group. Do you sort of wait until everyone at the table has silently read the text to themselves, or do you elect a narrator to read it out loud? I couldn't really say. But again, as a solo adventure, it was nice to just read all the text at my own pace. When it comes to acquiring new equipment, you just sort of say that you're doing it at certain junctions in the story and then sort out the purchases on your character sheet. Loremaster does not keep track of your character's inventory. In the end, you fairly quickly escape the fighting arena, and once you do, you have access to a bunch of different story locations, including sailing to islands, visiting markets, exploring a city, and engaging in a dungeon crawl. In my conversation with one of Pericle's creators, I was told that there were 3 things on the horizon. The first were more adventures that continue this current storyline. That's their top priority at the moment. After that, they want to introduce tools that allow third-party creators to publish their own Pericle adventures and make them available in a marketplace that ties seamlessly to the Pericle browser app. And finally, they want to eventually explore making Pericle more accessible in virtual tabletops so that everyone can play the game online with ease. Alright, so here are my thoughts on Pericle. Very close combat. Of the few combat scenarios that I sampled, I felt a sense of closeness. Admittedly, my characters didn't have the more powerful spells and disciplines in the game, and maybe those make combats a bit more dynamic, but from what I did experience, I felt like the hex-based combat sort of puts you in a room and has you fight it out. Failure is not an option. I think more and more in RPGs, you're seeing options that GMs can take that sidestep death for PCs when they run out of HP. But those options are born of a freedom that the Loremaster does not enjoy. In this game, the Loremaster is just administering a story, and each combat is a gate that you have to succeed at. If your party is defeated, there can't be an artful pirouette around the matter, such as, now you've all been taken prisoner and wake up in the town's prison, or something like that. You either win the combat encounter here, or the story doesn't move forward. An odd duck. I have to admit, I spent a little while getting used to the hybrid approach that this game takes. It's a very physical game when it comes to the combat, but you also need a computer or tablet to get the enemy stats and tactics, as well as the story. Not only does the game straddle two mediums, its very nature is that of an RPG mixed with a solo board game style of storytelling. Tactile fun. For what it's worth, I enjoyed the physicality of the adventure probably more than I would have if it was all digital. There's just something to be said about being able to reach out and touch game pieces and move them around a map that's physically on a table in front of you. This is not lost on the creators or on the many backers of the project on Kickstarter. Interactive story. Look, you can't just go off and do anything that you want in this adventure. It has a narrative that it wants to tell. You participate in it, and you can make choices to some degree, but compared to a sandbox RPG, it's pretty rigid. However, if you compare this adventure to, say, watching TV or reading a novel, it's a lot more interactive. And that interactivity creates a bit of buy-in into the story, especially once you're using your own characters instead of the pre-gens. I think in the end, if you think of the Gathering Darkness starter adventure as a proof of concept, it's a success. Because if you can tap the creativity of the larger community, then the sky is the limit in terms of interesting storylines, as well as dynamic combat encounters, and things you can do with player choices and with the themes themselves. Pericle doesn't have to be generic fantasy at all. It can be just about any genre where hex-based combat would make sense. You could probably even modify the rules a little bit to encompass starship or naval battles. And as far as a set storyline, that could easily be modified to include several or even dozens of possible endings depending on how you designed the branching decision trees. Again, this would all hinge on a big enough community of users adopting and playing this game and eventually designing for it. Whether or not that happens remains to be seen, but the game does stand out as a very unique hybrid RPG, board game, story game, whatever you want to call it. They should probably come up with a name for it. Anyway, thanks for watching. Links for everything are below. See ya.